take a slow, deep breath and let the imagined sights of the high Middle Ages gather around us. The cold stone of cathedrals, the heavy weight of mail armor, and the vast, parched lands of the Levant. The primary impetus for the Crusades did not originate in the West, but in a distant cry for help from the heart of the Christian East, from the magnificent, ancient city of Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, the resilient heir to the Roman Empire, was under immense pressure. Its territories in Anatolia, the empire's vital reservoir of manpower and agriculture, had been largely lost to the Seljuk Turks following a catastrophic Byzantine defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. The emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, realizing his empire was dangerously close to collapse, looked westward for mercenary troops to help reconquer his lost territory. In 1095, Alexios sent an embassy to Pope Urban II in Rome. He did not ask for a holy war. He asked for well-trained knights and soldiers. But Urban II, a shrewd and ambitious man, recognized a unique opportunity to achieve his own grander political and religious goals, to reassert papal authority, to establish the Roman papacy as the ultimate, undisputed moral and political leader of Latin Christendom, to heal the schism, to potentially heal the schism between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church that had formally split in 1054, to redirect feudal violence, to redirect the endemic, violent warfare between the constantly squabbling feudal lords and knights of Western Europe, away from Christian lands and toward an external, holy enemy. The moment of mobilization came in November 1095 at the Council of Clermont in France. Pope Urban II delivered one of the most effective and powerful speeches in history, transforming the request for military aid into a Imagine the scene. Thousands of clergymen, knights, and common people gathered in the open air, listening to the Pope's powerful, ringing voice. He spoke not merely of protecting the Byzantines, but of the immense spiritual indignities being suffered by the Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. He declared that the city of Jerusalem, the site of Christ's passion and resurrection, was under the control of unclean races who oppressed the faithful. He offered an unprecedented spiritual reward, plenary indulgence. By taking the vow of the Crusader and making the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, all sins would be forgiven, ensuring immediate entry into heaven, regardless of past crimes or transgressions. The effect was electrifying. The crowd roared with the spontaneous cry, Deus vult, God wills it. Thousands immediately took the vow, sewing a cross of fabric onto their outer garment, signifying their new identity as Crucis Ignati, those signed by the cross. The response to the Pope's call was twofold, resulting in two distinct, massive movements that launched the First Crusade. The first and most chaotic was the People's Crusade, or Peasants' Crusade, led by charismatic wandering preachers like Peter the Hermit. A vast, disorganized, and desperate horde of peasants, commoners, poor knights, and families began marching eastward in the spring of 1096. Imagine the absolute misery and utter lack of preparation. They possessed little food, no discipline, no centralized command, and a burning, volatile religious zeal. The journey across Central Europe quickly devolved into violence and anti-Semitic pogroms against Jewish communities in the Rhineland, whom they viewed as the enemy closer to home. Upon finally reaching Byzantine territory, they quickly alienated the Emperor Alexios and were disastrously routed and slaughtered by the Seljuks almost immediately upon crossing into Anatolia. This initial wave tragically ended in failure and chaos, but the main force, the Prince's Crusade, was a different matter entirely. This was a professional military expedition led by the greatest noblemen of Europe, Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Robert of Normandy. Imagine the sight of these feudal armies. Knights encased in heavy mail, riding war horses, accompanied by professional archers and support infantry, converging on Constantinople in late 1096 and early 1097. Emperor Alexios, terrified by the size and unpredictable nature of this force, quickly extracted oaths of fealty and promises that any former Byzantine lands conquered would be returned to the empire. The long march of the Prince's Crusade across Anatolia was a study in profound suffering, tactical brilliance, and almost unbelievable resilience. The first major victory came at the Siege of Nicaea in 1097, a former Byzantine city now held by the Turks, which the Crusaders, true to their oath, handed back to Alexios. The next great test was the Battle of Dorylaeum, where the Crusaders, marching in two separate columns, were ambushed by the massive Seljuk cavalry. They were saved only by the heavy discipline and the sheer weight of the armored knights, who formed a defensive line until the second column arrived to flank the Turks. The suffering was immense. The logistics were non-existent. The Crusaders constantly faced starvation, heat, disease, and the relentless, frustrating hit-and-run tactics of the Turkish horse archers. By the time they reached the great city of Antioch in October 1097, their numbers had been drastically reduced. The Siege of Antioch became a year-long test of faith and endurance. Imagine the desolate winter outside the massive, often resorting to eating their horses, their leather equipment, and even the enemy dead. Desertion was widespread, and morale plummeted. But just as the situation seemed hopeless, the city was betrayed to the Crusaders, who poured in and seized control. Their triumph, however, was immediately threatened. A massive relieving Turkish army, led by Kerboga of Mosul, arrived the very next day, trapping the Crusaders inside the walls they had just captured. The starving, beleaguered army was now the besieged. It was in this moment of utter desperation that a divine sign, or a psychological operation, turned the tide. A poor peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have had visions guiding him to the spot where the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side, was buried beneath the floor of the Church of St. Peter. After frantic digging, a piece of metal was discovered. Whether genuine or a pious fraud, the discovery had a profound, immediate psychological effect. Believing they carried the literal spear of God, the Crusaders, energized by a sudden divine assurance, marched out of the gates and attacked the massive Turkish army. The Turkish command, already plagued by internal rivalries and underestimating the Crusaders' desperation, broke, and the relieving army was scattered. The path to Jerusalem was finally open. The Crusaders, now a small, grim, hardened force, marched south along the coast, largely unopposed. In June 1099, they finally reached their ultimate goal. Imagine the profound, emotional power of that moment. A small band of European knights, having traveled thousands of miles and endured unimaginable suffering, standing on the heights overlooking the walls of Jerusalem. For many, the sight of the holy city brought tears, joy, and the fulfillment of a life's vow. The siege of Jerusalem was brief and brutal. After a 5-week siege, the Crusaders, using massive siege towers, breached the walls on July 15, 1099. The resulting entry into the city was a horrifying, bloody affair. Fueled by years of hardship, religious fanaticism, and a desire for vengeance against perceived persecutors, the Crusaders massacred most of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of the city. The First Crusade had achieved a complete, improbable, and terrifying success. They had not only answered the call of the emperor, but had done far more, establishing a European presence in the heart of the Levant. But the success came at a monstrous cost, a stain of blood and violence that would forever define the movement. The Crusaders, weeping and praying at the Holy Sepulchre, amidst the carnage they had wrought, had successfully taken the holy city. The world had fundamentally changed. We enter now the century following the First Crusade, a period where the initial, explosive energy of the movement settles into the grinding, complex reality of occupation and coexistence. The Crusaders had established a foreign presence in a vast, hostile land, the Crusader states, or Outremer, the land beyond the sea. These states were a unique, precarious experiment in European feudalism transplanted onto the Eastern Mediterranean. They were a chain of 4 primary entities: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Edessa. Imagine the political and cultural challenges. The population of these new states was overwhelmingly non-Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and Eastern Christian, and the Latin European elite were perpetually outnumbered, isolated, and reliant on an intermittent stream of pilgrims and reinforcements from the West. Life in Outremer was marked by a strange, often pragmatic coexistence between the Latin conquerors and the local populations. While the rulers held the ultimate political power, they had to rely on local tax collectors, administrators, and merchants to keep the fragile economy function. Latin lords often adopted aspects of local Eastern dress, food, and medicine, leading to a hybrid culture known as Syro-Frankish. The most distinctive and enduring innovation of this period was the creation of the military orders. These were the ultimate fusion of monastic devotion and military skill, orders of warrior monks dedicated to the defense of the Holy Land. Imagine the sight of these men, the Knights Templar, identified by their white robes bearing a red cross. They were the first and most powerful of the orders, renowned for their incredible bravery, their financial network that spanned Europe, and their massive, fortified castles. The Knights Hospitaller of St. John, identified by their black robes with a white cross, they began as an order dedicated to caring for sick pilgrims, but quickly grew into an equally powerful military force, defending crucial frontier fortresses. These orders provided the Crusader states with a professional standing army, bound by religious vow and corporate discipline, a military machine far more reliable than the fleeting feudal levies from Europe. Their castles, massive, geometrically complex stone fortresses like the Crac de Chevaliers, were the anchors of the Latin presence, defying the Muslim armies for decades. The precarious existence of the Crusader states was perpetually threatened. In 1144, the fall of the northernmost county of Edessa to the Turkish forces of Zengi sent a shockwave through Europe and prompted the call for the Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149. This crusade was led by the 2 most powerful monarchs in Europe, King Louis VII of France and the German Emperor Conrad III. Despite the immense resources, the Second Crusade was a complete, humiliating failure. It was poorly coordinated, suffered a disastrous defeat in Anatolia, and ended with a tactically senseless siege of the Muslim-held city of Damascus, an attack that violated an existing, useful treaty and only served to unite the local Muslim factions against the Crusaders. The political fragmentation that the Crusaders relied upon was slowly but inevitably being reversed by a new power that arose in Egypt, the Kurdish general Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. Saladin was a military genius and a master statesman who possessed a profound commitment to jihad, holy war, and the reunification of the Muslim world. He began by overthrowing the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, creating a powerful, unified base of operations. He then patiently unified the fractured Muslim states of Syria and Egypt under his single Ayyubid banner, systematically encircling the Crusader states. Saladin's statesmanship was as formidable as his generalship. He presented himself as the noble, disciplined counterpoint to the often petty, avaricious, and faithless Latin lords, lending immense moral weight to his cause. The inevitable, decisive clash occurred in 1187. The Crusaders, led by a newly arrived, aggressive, and strategically reckless king, Guy of Lusignan, were lured into a disastrous encounter away from their coastal fortresses. The Battle of Hattin on July 4, 1187, was the day the Crusader world turned to dust. Imagine the terrible scene on the twin hills of Hattin. The entire massed army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, desperately seeking water in the intense summer heat, was surrounded and cut off by Saladin's forces. The Crusaders, dehydrated and exhausted, were systematically crushed. The entire army was captured or destroyed. The moral victory was as crushing as the military one. Saladin captured the most sacred Crusader relic, the True Cross, and took King Guy prisoner, effectively dismantling the political and spiritual heart of Outremer in a single, devastating afternoon. Following Hattin, the defenses of the Crusader states crumbled swiftly. Saladin, with a relentless, disciplined campaign, took city after city. The climax of this period came on October 2nd, 1187, when Saladin entered Jerusalem. Imagine the profound contrast to the first conquest nearly 90 years earlier. Saladin did not order a massacre. He offered the Christian inhabitants the chance to pay a ransom and leave the city, allowing them to depart under the protection of his guards, an act of chivalry and piety that contrasted starkly with the bloody conquest of 1099. He restored the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque to Muslim worship, but crucially, allowed Christian pilgrims and Eastern Christians to remain and visit their holy visits. This crusade was led by the three most powerful monarchs in Europe, the so-called Three Kings Crusade. Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most formidable secular ruler of the age. Philip II Augustus, the King of France. Richard I, the Lionheart, the King of England, a figure whose reputation as a warrior was unmatched. The German contingent, led by Frederick Barbarossa, was vast and disciplined, but their success was cut short by tragedy. Imagine the immense, collective gasp of grief when the news arrived. Frederick Barbarossa drowned in 1190 while crossing a small river in Cilicia. His massive army, demoralized and fractured, largely dissolved before reaching the Holy Land, a massive blow to the Crusader cause. King Philip and King Richard, long-standing political rivals, arrived by sea to the scene of the action, the massive, ongoing siege of Acre. Imagine the incredible, tense atmosphere around the city of Acre. For nearly 2 years, the remaining Crusaders, including the survivors of Hattin, had been attempting to retake the heavily fortified port city, while Saladin's massive field army perpetually encircled the besiegers. The arrival of the French and English fleets and the immense resources they brought finally turned the tide. After a protracted siege, Acre fell in 1191, a crucial strategic victory that provided the Crusaders with a secure, vital port for supplies and reinforcements. However, the political rivalry between Richard and Philip quickly became toxic. Following the capture of Acre, Philip II, claiming illness and having secured his reputation, returned to France, leaving Richard the Lionheart as the undisputed, sole commander of the remaining Crusader forces. The rest of the crusade was a masterful, grinding campaign of attrition fought between Richard and Saladin, a confrontation of two military titans. The most decisive battle came shortly after Acre, at Arsuf in 1191. Imagine the relentless pressure of Saladin's light Turkish cavalry harassing the Crusader column as it marched south along the coast toward Jaffa. Richard, demonstrating a mastery of discipline rarely seen in Crusader armies, maintained a tight formation, protecting his forces against the endless barrage of arrows and the feigned retreats of the Turks. Finally, when the moment was strategically perfect, Richard ordered the charge of his heavy knights, a devastating display of European shock cavalry that shattered Saladin's army and secured the crucial coastal road. But Richard was a pragmatist, not a fool. He marched to within sight of Jerusalem twice, but he refused to attack the city. He understood the profound, tragic logistical flaw of every invasion. Taking Jerusalem was possible, but holding it deep in hostile territory without a constant supply of men and water was a strategic impossibility. The campaign concluded with the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192, a masterful diplomatic achievement. Result: the Crusaders secured the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa, which formed the new, stable core of the Outremer for the next century. Pilgrimage. Crucially, the treaty guaranteed safe, unarmed access for Christian pilgrims to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem. Richard left the Holy Land shortly after, exhausted and having successfully secured the primary strategic objective, a stable Crusader presence, even though he failed to recapture the city of Jerusalem itself. Saladin, the great unifier and counter-crusader, died the following year in 1193. The greatest confrontation of the Crusades had ended in a strategic political draw. The later Crusades were marked by a decline in strategic success and a profound increase in internal political motives, moving far beyond the original goals of the First Crusade, the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204. This expedition became the most politically cynical and tragic of all. Originally intended for Egypt, the Crusaders were diverted by the Venetians, culminating in the shocking sack of Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Christian world. Imagine the terrible sight of the Crusaders, who had vowed to defend Christendom, violently looting and destroying the greatest Christian city, shattering the Byzantine Empire, and ensuring the formal, final schism between the East and West. The papacy never truly recovered from the moral stain of this action. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, focused entirely on the strategic goal of conquering Egypt, the source of Ayyubid power. This crusade briefly seized the port city of Damietta, but was disastrously defeated when the Crusaders were flooded by the Nile River and forced to surrender. The Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229, led by the controversial, excommunicated Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, this crusade achieved a bloodless victory through diplomacy. Frederick, fluent in Arabic, negotiated a treaty that temporarily returned Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Crusader control, a bizarre, brief diplomatic triumph achieved without a major battle. The final Crusader presence in the Levant was extinguished in 1291 with the fall of Acre, the last great coastal stronghold. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt relentlessly besieged the city, and the last Christian defenders, including the remaining Knights Templar and Hospitaller, were killed or driven into the sea. The remaining Crusader fortresses were systematically dismantled, ensuring the Latin presence could not return. The Crusades, spanning 2 centuries, left an immense and often contradictory legacy, military and economic impact. They provided a profound stimulus for the development of naval power, massive logistical planning, and the expansion of trade between Europe and the Middle East, introducing new foods, spices, and technologies to the West. The Templars' financial network laid the foundations for modern banking practices. Political and religious legacy. They failed completely in their stated goal of permanently holding the Holy Land. They massively accelerated the schism between the Eastern and Western churches, and they left behind a legacy of profound bitterness, violence, and misunderstanding between Christian and Muslim worlds that would echo through the centuries. As we close this chronicle, remember the ultimate defining sound of the Crusades, not the roar of the crowds at Clermont, but the deep, resounding crash of the walls of Acre in 1291. signaling the end of an era and the final, enduring separation of East and West.